Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one there are a lot of developments. The Russians continue their offensive operations both within the Kursk region and into the Sumy region, while the Ukrainians continue their offensive operations into the border area between the Belgorod and Kursk regions. The Russians continued offensive operations across the Uska River line to expand their zone of control and on the eastern bank of the Uska River line as well, while the Ukrainian forces conduct counterattacks in both of these directions to negate some of these Russian advances. The Ukrainians also make some counterattacks here to the south of Pokrovsk, while the Russians made some of their own offensive operations in the north of Toretsk and to the northwest of Kursk. Starting out in the Kursk region, we see that the Russians have managed to capture the final parts of the first patch area here to the northwest of Goevo along the border area. With this, they have full control over the forest patch area in between the northern and southern remains of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion. The Russians will here work to gain control over the remaining parts here near Goronel and the remaining parts near Oleshnia separately. At the same time, the Russians continued offensive operations within the Sumy region, where fighting continues across the Luknia river line towards Luknia, as well as within Shuravka, while they are also entering a third point here in the direction of Volodymyrivka, where fighting is taking place over the first buildings within the town. Therefore, we see that the Russians are expanding their Sumy incursion here in these days, where they are increasing the pressure on the Ukrainian forces on a wider front from Volodymyrivka in the northwest and likely expand all the way to Sadki to the south, where the objective is to gain control over both the road here along Oleksivka in the northwest and the main highway through Suchia towards Yunakivka in the east, as well as a strong flank with the forest patch area to the south. With this, the Russians will likely be expanding their Sumy incursion into these wider areas, while they fight over the remaining parts of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion. The Ukrainians continue their own Belgorod incursion, where they have managed to capture the town of Lipsy, which is really non-existent. I don't really know why it has a name, but it's a name on a forest patch. They've managed to capture these forest patches along the border area, and they are now fighting within the outskirts of the town of Prileste and on a wider area along the border zone towards the southern parts of Grafovka, along the forest lines and forest patches, and they also continue their fighting in the direction of Demidovka. The Ukrainians have established their positions across the border area in these forest lines, and they have cleared a lot of the minefields along a wider front for a potential larger offensive here into the Belgorod region. The Ukrainians are fighting the Russians near the towns of Demidovka, where they are attempting to gain a foothold for further offensive operations to gain control over the town. They're also fighting along the first lines and first patches near Grafovka from the northern and southern banks of the river line. And they're also fighting over the towns here to the south. So there are three main areas of their offensive operations right now, and the main fighting is taking place. As the Ukrainians are attempting to reach the towns, they are in direct confrontation with the Russian forces positioned within those towns. And at the same time, they are getting struck by Russian artillery and FPV drones whenever they cross the border, as the Russians are constantly doing reconnaissance over the border crossings in this area during this Ukrainian offensive. The Ukrainians are said to have been facing heavy resistance by the Russian forces ever since they attempted to start crossing over, with their first results 4 days ago, and yet to this day they have not managed to gain control besides of a single town, which consists of expensive forest patches. The remaining parts they're fighting is still taking place at the outskirts of these Russian towns. So we see that the success that they saw in the Kursk incursion is definitely not apparent here, and that is due to the fact that the Russians were expecting such an operation. It seems they were completely prepared for it. They have additional forces necessary to protect the border areas, and the Ukrainians did not properly plan for this the same way they planned for the Kursk incursion. It seems more like a diversion, distraction, or an impulsive maneuver following the collapse of the Kursk incursion. In the eastern section of the front line, the Russians managed to re-enter Feolivka, the outskirts of it, near the river line, where the fighting is now taking place within the outskirts of the town. The Ukrainians recently recaptured the town, and now fighting is taking place over it, as the Russians are looking to regain control of it, while the Ukrainians are looking to push onwards towards the Uskar River line and cut off some of these Russian bridgeheads across it to improve their own positions and limit the Russian bridgehead. We also see that the Ukrainians have been launching counterattacks near Zapatne, where they regain control over some of the forest patches to the north. Now they're also recapturing some of the forest patches to the west, and they are encroaching on the town from several directions. The Ukrainians also managed to recapture the positions within Petropavlivka. The Russians did not have a strong presence within the town, only a few soldiers, mostly covered by FPV drones, while their objective was simply to prevent the Ukrainians from establishing positions within the northern parts of the town. The Ukrainians launched a counterattack and managed to regain full control over the town, and fighting is now taking place within the outskirts of Sinkivka, where the Ukrainians are looking to recapture the town there. With their re-entry into the forest patch area over the recent counterattacks, they may be able to re-enter Sinkivka and start regaining control over that town as well, and start fighting over the fortified positions here near Liman Pershi through the forest patch areas, where the Ukrainians here are launching a mid-sized counterattack both on the western bank of the Uskar River line and north of Kupiansk to negate the months of advances the Russians have made here in this area to improve their positions. Just south of this, the Russians have improved their positions within Zaharizove. Following the capture of the town, they have now captured the forest patch area to the west of the town as well. They have gained control over the northern bank of the Lozova River, both here to the west and to the east. This indicates that the next objective of the Russians will be the northern bank of the Lozova River line, where they will attempt to gain control over Novokrokhlyakivka and the remaining fortified positions here to the north. Following which they'll likely, rather than across the river line, focus on the eastern parts near Lozova and the towns in the fortified positions, the first line of defense of the Ukrainians near Borova, where they'll advance in a southern direction, expanding their pressure across the Serbets river line by capturing towns such as Novozerhivka and improving positions near Nadia, but also to push here near Selenie High and towards the Uskar River line from the western bank, where the objective will be to flank some of the fortified positions and the river line through the open fields and fortified positions to the east. To the northern section of Toretsk, the Russians have improved the positions further by gaining control over additional fortified positions along the Sverdlovets Canal, and also improving the positions north of Druzhba. The fighting will likely expand to the forest patch areas here to the north of Druzhba, following which the Russians will look to connect their forces along the forest lines and the fortified positions along the canal, before moving onwards along the main railway here north of the city towards Dashna and Delivka. The Russians will look to secure the northern flank of Toretsk and move onwards towards these towns along the main railway, where they'll use the cover of the forest lines alongside the railway and the high ground advantages through the railway to flank these fortified positions and gain control over the northern flank of Toretsk. The objective of the Russians would be to secure the northern flank before they move onwards towards the western flank, as the northern flank will be for offensive operations directed towards the city, which is unlikely that the Russians are aiming for right now. Instead, it will more likely be to secure the western parts. For that, they need to secure the northern parts to concentrate their forces in the western direction and achieve the biggest possible advantage here fighting with the forces that they have available. But with this, we see that there's been quite a while since the last Ukrainian advances in the area. The latest advance was in the southern district on the 12th of March, which is now 11 days ago. In the direction of Pokrovsk, we see it in the southern flank that the Ukrainians launched a counterattack north of Uspinivka, where they are looking to enter Solone here in the eastern direction. They're attempting to bypass both Novovasilivka and Uspinivka through the Solone river line, gain control over Solone, then move onwards towards Vovkove, which will cut off the supplies of the Russian forces towards Kotline. At the same time, the Ukrainians restarted counterattacks in the direction of Shevchenko, where they are looking to re-enter the town and improve their positions in the area. The Ukrainians continue their attempts to dislodge the Russian offensive operations west of Pokrovsk, where they are constantly launching drones on the supply lines of the Russian forces in the area. Russian soldiers from this section of the front line complain that as soon as the logistics leave Selidove towards the front line, the Ukrainians already start with their FPV drone strikes on those positions. So the Russians have to fight through about 10 kilometers of constant drone strikes by the Ukrainians to resupply their forces at the front line. And it is under these circumstances that the Russian forces attempt to defend their flanks and improve their offensive operations in the area. And this is why the Russians have struggled to advance and are now focusing entirely on defense and some local counterattacks to improve their positions rather than to continue their offensive operations. At the same time, the Russians made significant advances here south of Vyasenove and Zaporizhia, where they are gaining control over the forest lines and fields here along the main highway between Andreevka and Selidove. The Russians are here looking to gain control over the area between Zaporizhia in the north and Andreevka to the south to improve their positions and continue offensive operations towards the border area of the Dnipropetrovsk region. With these advances, we see that the Russians continue their offensive operations in most of the front line, but the Ukrainians are also attempting to improve their own positions rather than launching one massive counteroffensive like they have done over the past few years. They are switching to the Russian strategy, which is a much smaller but much more sustainable and consistent counterattack, which is their efforts both in the Belgorod direction, also their local counterattacks in the direction of Kursk and Sumi, their counterattacks in the Kupiansk and Oska Riverline directions, as well as in the Toretsk and Pokrovsk directions, where previously they would concentrate half a dozen of brigades in a single point to attempt to break through the Russian lines. They're now spreading each of these brigades into different sections of the front line, where they attempt to improve their positions through these local sustainable counterattacks. This makes the situation more difficult for the Russians to advance, as the Ukrainians are committing some of their reserves to the front line that they've been training over the past few months. However, this is simply doubling down on a battle of attrition, which the Russians have a significant advantage within, and this further complicates the Ukrainian prospects for future battles. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.